in the US environment are going to be key for really grasping the material in Domain 1 for the CIPP US exam. Hello, welcome back to Privacy Professional Training. My name is Fumi Obalabi. Today I want us to look at the CIPP US exam, and we're going to be looking at Domain 1. So there have been changes to the CIPP US exam, and I want us to talk about that. Domain 1 of the CIPP US exam is basically talking about the US environment, and I want us to look at different themes when studying for the test. Essentially, Domain 1 provides a foundation in understanding US privacy law. So while nobody can predict the exact questions, looking at the themes for this first domain is going to set a foundation for your level of understanding as you take the test. And you're going to see that a lot of the questions come from within this domain. It basically introduces different types of legal structures like enforcement concepts that frequently underpin different questions you're going to encounter in the privacy questions. So a lot of the scenarios across the privacy certifications, they draw assumptions from this one domain. About 33 of the questions that you might encounter may come from this particular domain, which is why I wanted to spend time talking about it in today's video. So this domain can help students become familiar with unfamiliar concepts that is going to help with all the other domains that you're going to encounter throughout the test. And rather than focusing on memorization, this domain helps you to start thinking analytically, right? We already know in the United States that there's a certain approach to privacy that you might not see in other privacy certifications, like if you're going to be taking the CIPP EU exam, right? The US has a very unique way of explaining and implementing privacy, and this domain sets the foundation and framework for understanding how the US privacy laws work. So the first thing we're going to talk about is how US privacy law is structured, and some key structural components and concepts that you need to manage when you're looking at Domain 1 and you start studying for the test is the fact that the United States doesn't rely on a single comprehensive federal privacy law, right? And even when I took the exam back in 2019, there was no federal comprehensive privacy law. And if you're going to be taking the test in 2026, it's still the same thing. Instead, privacy obligations are spread across multiple laws, and they apply to specific sectors, types of data, or regulated activities. Now, this is a really important foundational key step that you need to learn if you are going to be answering questions for the CIPP US exam. So this approach is considered to be fragmented or sector specific. And that's really important when you're looking at questions and scenarios for this exam. So some of the questions may require you to recognize that there are different legal rules that apply in different contexts. So some of the broad assumptions about uniform privacy rights are less helpful for the US system. And you need to remember this when you take the test. Understanding this structure, the fragmented structure, can assist you in identifying different legal principles that are more relevant in a specific given situation. And when you're evaluating hypothetical scenarios, it's really useful to consider, like, which industry is it? Is it the healthcare industry? Is it the financial industry? Is it children's data? The data type, whether it's a name, sensitive data, and then purpose. So you need to be looking at all of these because they're going to support an informed analysis when you're looking at the questions. Now, some of the core legal concepts in US privacy law that frequently shape your analysis are going to be a reasonable expectation of privacy, right? You have to look at what is reasonable. That's a really key term, and reasonable expectation is going to differ based on the scenario. That's also something that you need to look at. And it plays a really important role in US privacy analysis when you're looking at each question for your test. And what this concept really looks at is the idea that privacy protections are depending on the context rather than being absolute. So we talked a little bit about, industry really mattering. And in some scenarios, individuals tend to have a higher expectation of privacy in personal or sensitive settings and lower expectations in public or work-related environment. And again, this is a key foundational principle because when we get to a separate domain related to workplace privacy, we are going to see the reasonable expectation play a part in the evaluation that students are doing. So when it comes to data collection, often there is a requirement to set a specific expectation. And during the review of the US environment, there is a focus on whether a practice feels intrusive. And there's an analysis that you as a student need to consider. What would a reasonable person anticipate? So when you're looking at the questions, what is reasonable reasonable, and reasonable is going to be context specific. So in addition to this concept can be relevant when you're evaluating the legality or appropriateness of a certain data practice. And you have to keep in mind that industry also plays a part in this US environment. There's lots of different factors that you're looking at help you with your reasoning. Now, another really key concept when we're looking at the US environment is notice and choice, right? Notice and choice are central elements that you have to keep considering with all the questions. And they play a part in the US privacy framework in that organizations are generally expected to inform individuals about how personal data is collected, used, and shared. So you're always thinking about notice and choice, right? Some of the choice mechanisms are opt-outs, right? We're going to encounter US privacy laws that look at opting out as a methodology for different individuals depending on the context. Now, there are some US state laws that we're going to encounter further down the line in other domains that don't necessarily explicitly mention opt-out. When you're looking at analysis for your questions in the US environment, you're going to see that unclear notice may cause concern and is definitely a theme that you should look at in the US environment. Now, another really crucial discussion is transparency. Transparency plays a critical role in evaluating compliance. You're going to encounter this theme in the US environment and in several questions on the test. So when you're reviewing privacy practices for each specific question, you need to see and consider whether individuals were meaningfully informed, right? That's very important in the US environment. And these three principles that I've mentioned often influence how data practices are assessed. You have to look at everything from the context of what the question is asking you to be able to determine what the right response is going to be on your test. Something else that is really prevalent in the US environment relates to enforcement, and US privacy enforcement frequently focuses on harm, deception, and unfairness, right? If you have started your studies for the test and you've been looking at domain 1, a lot of the themes that you're going to see is that there's going to be a focus on impact rather than purely compliance. So not every technical misstep is necessarily going to lead to regulatory consequences in the US environment. Instead, your analysis of the question should consider whether an individual was misled or exposed to unreasonable risk, right? The US environment looks a lot at the word reasonableness, whether it's unreasonable or reasonable. There are going to be scenarios that describe consumer injury or misuse of data or misleading practices, and these may give cause or rise to enforcement concerns. So I think there are certain words that should be learned in regards to this domain, because you're going to be comparing harm-based reasoning to right-based systems, and this can help you to clarify the US approach. Understanding the different models in the US environment are going to be key for really grasping the material in domain 1 for the CIPP US exam. You're also going to be able to understand the model and how it provides for certain practices that attract regulatory attention, right? Every geography is different. I've mentioned before that privacy is jurisdiction specific, and you need to understand what is of crucial importance in the US environment. So the next thing that we're going to talk about in domain 1 relates to enforcement and the framework for enforcement in the United States. The main regulatory body is the Federal Trade Commission. Understanding the roles and responsibilities that each oversight body, being able to understand what each regulator has authority over is going to be very important, because in the United States, it's fragmented. We're looking at privacy from a federal level, state level, and then industry level, right? And there are different enforcement bodies for each single level. Understanding those clearly and having a clear understanding. On the federal level, this is the enforcement body. On the state level, this is the enforcement body. There are definitely going to be questions on the exam that look not just at risk, but also who is the enforcement body, what types of actions could be instituted against an organization. As you continue on your journey to be a privacy professional, you're going to need to be able to understand what's at stake for the organization, which privacy laws apply and on which level, and what is the potential authority that could issue a fine or enforcement action against my organization. So we're going to be looking at each exam domain by domain, and I'm going to be talking about different themes and concepts that you really need to grasp tightly before taking the test. I really hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any comments or questions, leave them below, and I'll see you in another video.